Well, welcome to today's educational webcast. Today's topic is kind of Medicare 101. Today's presenter, Peter Stoner, is a specialist, been in the industry over 45 years and is a real quote-unquote kind of encyclopedia in this area.
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone. In full disclosure, David mentioned that I had been in this for 45 years. It's actually 30. I don't want to fast forward too much of this, but I've been working for health plans for about half that time, and I've been working as a consultant and or broker for individual Medicare beneficiaries for the last 15 years or so. The significant part of my background is that I was the manager of the retiree health plan called Tufts Health Plan in Massachusetts. It was in fact remains the number one Medicare Advantage plan in the state. I ran the department that provides Medicare plans to the retirees of large companies. Large companies back in the day were companies like Raytheon and General Electric, GE, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and so forth. And after that, I became the director of Medicare sales at Fallon. So I've got this extensive background in Medicare. So what are we going to learn today? We're going to learn what is Medicare and how does it work? How can you enroll? Very importantly, when can you enroll? So that's where a lot of questions come along. When can I enroll in Medicare? Will I be penalized if I don't do something by a certain time? And so forth. We're going to cover that. And then significantly, what other options are available under Medicare? So when you have Medicare, there's two parts, and we're going to talk about them, Part A and Part B. Once you have those two parts of Medicare, you have health insurance. But there are deductibles and there are co-insurance and other exposure to cost. So people inevitably will take either a supplement plan or a Medicare Advantage plan to fill in those gaps. So I use the analogy of a maze to describe Medicare. And I do that because it can become so confusing. You know, as I mentioned, I've been doing this for 30 years, so it's second nature to me. But most people who are doing Medicare or going on to Medicare are doing that for the first time. They're inundated with all sorts of literature. Some of the information is conflicting. Some of the information is not state appropriate. Sometimes Massachusetts, for example, is considered an exception state. So some of the information that's read online by beneficiaries in Massachusetts actually doesn't even apply to them. So it gets very confusing. I get people all the time that'll call me and say things like, you know, I have 3 degrees, legitimately, and I can't figure this stuff out. So if you're having some confusion or it seems muddled, just know that that's normal. So David asked me to specifically include this slide. It has to do with the fact that oftentimes individuals who are joining Medicare are doing so around their 65th birthday, and yet they have a spouse who's younger. So if you're going to retire at 65 and go on to Medicare, well, what about your younger spouse? And there are, in Massachusetts, it's the masshealthconnector.org. Every other state has their own, what they typically refer to as a health connector. And you can Google that, find out what's appropriate in your state. If you're not in Massachusetts, it's essentially a means of accessing individual health plans in a way where you can see them side by side, so you can compare them. You don't have to go individually to every one of the providers out there. You can go to some sort of a state-provided website and shop that way. Very few brokers get involved in what we call the individual market for people who are not eligible for Medicare. It's simply a lot of work. There's very little compensation involved in it. I happen to know one person in Massachusetts that I can refer people to. It took me a long time to find him. So if you need a referral because you have a younger spouse, I can let you know that. And typically, spouses can be covered under COBRA, but COBRA is usually pretty expensive. So COBRA historically charges a premium of 100% of what you and the company were paying, and they tack on an additional 2% for an administrative fee. So it's not inexpensive. That said, Sometimes if you work for a particularly large company, that large company is offered a better premium because they have more employees over whom to diversify the risk, so they get a better rate. The fact that you're paying 102% of a better rate may in fact be better than an individual rate. So that's something that you would compare side by side. So what is Medicare and how does it work? I think most people know that Medicare is a federal government insurance program primarily for people who are over 65. So they're turning 65, they're going on to Medicare, or they are eligible for Medicare due to some form of special needs. I would say of my clients, I have a lot of clients, and I've got a few who are there because of special needs. By far and away, most people are eligible due to the fact that they turn 65 and they're retiring, or they're over 65. They've been working for an employer with more than 20 employees, so a real small company with 19 or less employees. Those employees are supposed to go on Cobra when they, not Cobra, I'm sorry. They're supposed to go on a Medicare product when they turn 65. But if you're working for an employer with over 20, which I know you are, then you can stay on your corporate health plan until such time as you choose to retire. So Medicare doesn't include everything. People tend to assume that it does. It, for example, does not include a maximum out-of-pocket cap on your costs. So essentially the sky is the limit. And that's one of the reasons why people will take either the supplement, which doesn't have virtually any costs associated with it, or they take an Advantage plan, which will cap your maximum out-of-pocket costs. So the sky's not the limit on either of those types of plans. But if you're just on Medicare, you're exposed to substantial risk because you don't have a limit. Doesn't include coverage outside of the United States. So that's provided by the Advantage plan or the supplement plan, but not Medicare itself. Medicare doesn't cover you if you're outside of the United States. So if you're going on Medicare and you're going to retire to Spain or wherever, Medicare doesn't cover you outside of the United States. But these health plans do. Also does not cover prescription coverage. So in 2006, the government introduced Medicare Part D. The name alone conveys that it is provided by Medicare. It's provided by private health insurance carriers, most of whom are national players. So you do have some Health Part D plans, the prescription piece, with carriers that are indigenous to your particular state, but most of them are national in scope. So they're big companies. They have millions of beneficiaries, and they can diversify their risk accordingly. Using Medicare as your primary insurance allows you to use any primary doctor or specialist who accept Medicare. So that's an enormous network of doctors. In Massachusetts, 96% of all the doctors accept Medicare. And the 4% who don't are primarily comprised of some form of mental health therapist. That could be a psychologist, that could be a psychiatrist. That category, the doctors tend not to like their reimbursement from Medicare, so they tend not to take it. So if you find a doctor that doesn't take it, usually it's some form of mental health therapist. It's not your cardiologist or your oncologist. Virtually all of them take Medicare. That is essentially the golden goose of healthcare. Medicare, a lot of the money that goes to doctors and hospitals in this country comes from Medicare. So Medicare has two parts. There's Part A that covers hospital visits. So in that, there is a deductible. So if you have Part A and Part B of Medicare, you have health insurance, as I mentioned earlier. Part A will cover the hospital piece. So if you're hospitalized, or anyone is hospitalized, and they have Part A, they incur a deductible this year of $1,632. So that's a big nut. And you should know that that's not an annual deductible. That's a per benefit period deductible. and a new benefit period happens every 60 days after someone has been discharged from the hospital. So if you know somebody and they just had Medicare and they were admitted to the hospital in January and went back in April, that $1,632 deductible that they'd owed in January, they owe it all over again in April. That's one of the things that gets filled in. That's one of the gaps left in Medicare that get filled in by a supplement plan, most supplements in its entirety. So the supplement plan would pick up that whole $1,632. If you were on an Advantage plan, you'd have to pay a copayment, but it wouldn't be $1,632. So it'd be appreciably less than that amount, but you would have some exposure to cost. The premium for most people for Part A is zero. And that's why when people turn 65, they can take Part A for nothing. It's not going to cost them. So I usually advise people when you're turning 65, you continue to work, at least take Part A of Medicare. The one exception to that is if you have an HSA. If you have a health savings account, which is associated with a high deductible health plan, then if you take Part A, you need to stop contributing to that HSA. Now, an HSA is a means of accumulating money that you will spend later on in life on medical care. So it's very important. And it's important that you grow that HSA as large as you can. So I tell people, if you're turning 65, you have an HSA, you want to continue to contribute to that HSA, do not take Part A. You can defer it, and certainly don't take Part B, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. Now, the important thing is you also note that Part A will cover you in the hospital, skilled nursing facility stays. Now, when I say skilled nursing facility stays, I mean rehab. So you've had an issue, say you've broken a hip, you've been treated at the hospital, they then refer you to a skilled nursing facility for rehab. That's covered under Medicare. But what's not covered is if you're going to be in a nursing home for custodial care for the remainder of your life. In other words, you're not going to get any better. So that's not covered under Medicare, but rehab is. So Medicare Part B is medical insurance. It covers your doctor visits, covers your tests, covers 8 outpatient procedures. Now, this one does have a copay, or a premium rather, that's charged by the federal government, charged by Social Security every month. And so you don't want to take Part B until such time as you're actually transitioning to Medicare. There are a lot of people who get confused by this and take Part B prematurely. So they incur that minimum premium this year of $176.70, $174.70 on a monthly basis. And if they're not on an Medicare plan, they're paying that premium for no reason. And it happens. So just make sure you're on your employer group plan. Certainly don't take Part B. If you're on an employer plan and you have an HSA, don't even take Part A when you turn 65. So the premium for Part B varies from the low that I mentioned, $174.70, to a high of $675 per person per month for the same benefit, the same Part B premium. Now, why is that? It's because in recent years, the premium for Part B has become correlated to your income. So if you're a high wage earner, and the federal government will define this year high wage earner of anybody who, as a single person, made $103,000, or as a married couple, $206,000 2 years ago. They always look back 2 years. So this year, in 2024, they'll be looking at your 2022 tax return. And that's the only return they look at. They don't look at 23 and 22. They look back 2 years, not consecutive years, 2 years, in this case, 2022. And so that you know it's a line 11 or 12 on your federal tax return. So look that up, see what the figure is, see if you're going to owe more. And if you do owe more, you could owe relatively substantially more. Know this, you can contest the amount the government says that you owe them. Could be that you had 2 years ago, you sold a house. And let's say you got $1 million for the house. And there's a capital gain involved in that shows up on your tax return and it puts you in a higher bracket. Well, you can contest that because now 2 years later in 2024, you're retiring. You don't have that house to sell anymore. That's gone. That transaction has ended. And it could be that you're only working a fraction of the year in 2024 relative to the 12 months that you worked in 2022, and you can contest it on that basis as well. So don't get overly shocked when you receive the bill from Social Security. Know that you have the power to contest it. Now, Part B, told you about the premium, it also has a deductible. It's an annual deductible, so it's one and done. That deductible is $240. And what triggers that is either a doctor visit or a test that is relatively significant. And by that, I mean if you're just going to the doctor because it's a checkup or if it's a follow-up to another visit, that's not going to trigger that deductible. So I have been on a supplement plan for years. 2 years ago, my deductible was triggered by some minor shoulder surgery. But last year, when I had 3 sort of wellness type visits, I didn't have to pay the deductible at all. So although it's there to be charged, it's not always charged. What is charged, if all you had was Medicare, is coinsurance. So if you go to the surgeon, for example, who's a doctor, obviously, the Medicare, if you have A and B of Medicare, will pick up 80% of the balance. But that puts you on the hook for 20%. So I remind people that 20% of a big number can still be a big number. When I was 50, I had a ruptured appendix. I was on a commercial health plan at the time, so it didn't cost me anything, but the surgeon's fee was $25,000. If I had been on just Medicare at that time, my piece of that would have been $5,000. So most supplement plans will pick it up in its entirety. Medicare Advantage plans will pick that up for a copayment. Now, this slide is significant because it gives you the breakdown of what you would pay. But know this, again, up at the upper right-hand corner of that slide, that is the form SSA-44, that can be used to contest the charge. And usually that contesting is based on the fact that you're not generating the income either through retirement or because you sold an asset. Could be you sold a house, you sold a company, anything that is an aberration in terms of your income. It happened, but it's not going to happen again. So government's pretty liberal in accepting the rationale behind it. They know that most people, the year that they retire, make less money than they did 2 years before they retired, and they base their actions accordingly. But the uppermost bracket is if you made $500,000 as a single person or $750,000 as a couple, that's when they hit you for that $675 that I mentioned before. So most of the time people pay something, or most of my clients pay something approaching $400 for their Part B, if in fact they continue to generate the income that they did while they were working. If they don't, then they're wise to file that form. And I mentioned you can file it anytime it applies. So it could be you retire in 2024, so you're going to work 8 months, whereas you worked 12 months in 2022. But then the next year, 2025, you're not going to work any months. So you can file the form again. So any year in which your income is expected to drop, you can refile the form. So there's a whole bunch of enrollment periods under Medicare. Clearly, the major enrollment period is called your initial enrollment period. They call it IEP. Government always has initials for things. And that's a 7-month window surrounding your 65th birthday. So they give you 3 months before the month in which you turn 65, the month in which you turn 65, and 3 months thereafter, or 7 months, to enroll in Medicare, either just Part A or A and B, depending on your circumstances. Once that 7-month window is gone, it's gone forever. So you never have an initial enrollment period once your first one is gone. So then the next enrollment people, and this is period, and this is the one that I get involved in most of the time. So somebody has been working, they've turned 65. I find nowadays people tend to work a little longer. I remember in my father's day, people had to retire when they were 65. It was pretty much mandatory. Now it isn't. And if you like what you're doing, a lot of people just continue to do it. Most of the people that call me, I'm guessing their average age is 68. So I get a number of them that have worked for at least 3 years, sometimes quite a bit longer than that. I had a man last year who was going on Medicare for the first time. He was 92. So, that's not something that you find very often. But this guy, to his credit, was a lawyer, and he just loved it, and he just kept on doing it. Anyhow, he transitioned to Medicare when he was 92. So that's called, when you're retiring, you're losing your coverage through your employer. That's called the special election period, a SEP. And the government will give you an 8-month window to get onto a Medicare plan after you've left your employer group coverage. Now, in reality, most people don't wait 8 months. Most people don't wait any time at all. So if their coverage with their employer ends the last day of April, for example, they have their Part A and especially Part B starting the next day, April 1st. So it's a natural dovetail. There's no gaps in their coverage. The only time that I find that people sort of run up into that 8-month window is when they have a younger spouse, so that they stay on a plan or they stay on COBRA, and I'm going to talk about COBRA a little more later, longer than they should. And when that happens, they've opened themselves up to penalties. So you need to be real careful about that 8-month window on a SEP. Penalties that are charged by Medicare stay with you for the rest of your life. And the only way you can avoid them is all of a sudden you become low income. And nobody has that as a goal. Okay, but if you do, then they'll stop penalizing you. But otherwise, the penalties are with you for the rest of your life. So if you miss those 2 open enrollment periods, then there's the general open enrollment period. That means you missed the first 2. That means you're going to be penalized in some way, but they give you the first quarter of the following year to join a health plan. And the time when most people make changes after they've enrolled in Medicare is up there in the upper right-hand corner in red. That's the annual enrollment period. That's when you start to see advertisements for Medicare on television. It's just one after another. And that starts October 15th every year, and it ends on December 7th, where people of my generation understand that to be Pearl Harbor Day, so it's of significance. So when you turn 65, you essentially have 4 options as it comes to healthcare. One is you stay on your employer plan. You can decline Part A, and you most especially want to decline Part B if you're going on your employer plan, if you're staying on your employer plan. Next one is to just go on Medicare, A and B. I mentioned earlier, that's health coverage. Problem is you're exposed to a lot of risk when you do that. And unfortunately, the people who do that the most are the people of limited means. So they're the least able to handle a health expense shock of a surgery or a major hospitalization. But, you can say certainly that it's better than nothing. What most people do is they go on option 3, which is a Medicare Advantage plan. That's also known as a Medicare Part C plan. That's provided by health carriers that are in Massachusetts. The carriers are like Tufts, Fallon, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Health New England. More and more, they're coming from outside of the state, like Humana, like AARP, United. The list goes on and on. Every year there's new companies that are added to that list. The same companies that offer Medicare Advantage plans typically also offer the Medicare supplement plans. As I mentioned earlier, that's called a Medigap plan because it fills in the gaps left by Medicare. Remember, Medicare does not cover prescriptions. So when somebody goes on one of those supplement/Medigap plans, they also need to take what's known as a standalone Part D plan to cover their prescriptions. So the supplement and the Part D plan together cover the health portion of their health care and their prescription portion of their health care, similar to the plans that you have at work right now. Prescriptions are incorporated within the plan, not so under Medicare. So in this slide, I tend to talk about my wife and I. We're both on Medicare. The reason I do that is that I find that people remember it better than if I just sort of read it. This slide is got the highest risk at the top of the page, and as you go down towards the bottom of the page, you're minimizing your exposure to risk. I mentioned just a while ago that having just A and B of Medicare is health coverage, but it exposes you to enormous risk. So, there's no limit to your costs. So that's to be avoided unless you're independently wealthy and you figure you're going to self-fund your retirement health care. But the next one that has risk associated with it, but it's less than just Medicare, is a Medicare Advantage plan, Part C. So since the beginning, my wife and I are 8 months apart in age. So I turn whatever before she does, but at some point during the course of a year, we're both the same age. And since we've been on Medicare, she's been on a Medicare Advantage plan since the very beginning. Her Medicare Advantage plan has always had a zero premium. People always say, how is that possible? How do you get anything for nothing? And the answer to that is you don't. Medicare Advantage plans all have a contract with the federal government. The federal government pays the health plans on a per capita basis somewhere in the vicinity of $950 per member per month. So the federal government is paying for my wife somewhere over $1,000 now because she's older than 65. So they're paying a chunk of change to the health plan, and the health plan in turn has got to take care of all of her medical coverage. Now they do charge her a copayment for everything. It's on her plan, it's $10 for a primary, it's $35 for a specialist. A hospitalization is $375 a day. They stop charging her that hospitalization charge after 5 days. Doesn't mean they have her leave the hospital. It means they stop charging her premium. In addition to that, because these plans are very profitable for health plans, they add benefits because they're trying to entice you to join them. So on my wife's plan, they'll reimburse her $1,000 for dental. She doesn't have to use a special network. Some of them you do. She doesn't. My wife is very healthy. We put her on an Advantage plan in the beginning because she had no health issues and she didn't take any prescriptions. Well, fast forward whatever number of years later, she still doesn't take any prescriptions and she's still healthy, and knock on wood, and she's going to stay on that Advantage plan as long as I can say those two things, that she's healthy and she doesn't have any prescriptions. Once that changes and she starts to accumulate specialists and or she starts to accumulate prescriptions, that's when I'll look at transitioning her during the annual enrollment period into a supplement plan. So a supplement plan is going to contain her risk more than the Advantage plan is. But right now, I would say in the time that she has been on an Advantage plan and I've been on a supplement plan, she has saved us in premium alone about $20,000. So that's significant. But again, I look to contain risk. I think right now the risk that she is exposed to is if she had a number of hospitalizations and was exposed to those copays, or if she started to have a number of specialists. But right now, she's paying on a monthly basis about $180 less than I am. So that's a good deal for us. But she took it again because she was healthy, limited prescriptions. I'm going to fast forward now to the Supplement 1A plan at the bottom. This is called Plan G if you're outside of Massachusetts. And this is the plan that I've been on since it's been offered. It wasn't offered when I was initially eligible for Medicare. It was the Sup 1 or Plan F that was offered. But since then, Plan 1A and or G has been offered in the market. I believe that was in 2020 that was offered. In any event, what this does is it allows me access to any doctor in the country, not just Massachusetts, but in the country who takes Medicare. I mentioned earlier that's 96% of the doctors in Massachusetts. So that's by far and away the vast majority of doctors. I did that because I had cancer when I was 55. So, once you go through an experience like that, your infallibility is no longer exists. So I wanted to very much minimize my risk. I did so through a Medicare supplement plan. We could argue that I've overpaid because I haven't been to the hospital the whole time that I've been on Medicare. I haven't needed that extra coverage, but I would suggest that it's given me peace of mind, and that's why I continue to do it. After all, I am not getting younger each year. I'm actually getting older, if you can believe it. So I did that to minimize my risk. I would continue to do that. I'm pleased that I did it, but it's not for everyone. So you have a choice. Part of that choice is to analyze the doctor's network that you're associated with. We want to say, so do your doctors take Advantage plans? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. They have to have a contract with a specific health plan in order to take it. And most doctors may take one or two, sometimes even three Medicare Advantage plans, but some doctors don't take any. And if they don't take any and you want to continue to see that doctor, you'd need to take a supplement plan to gain that access. So prescription drugs under Medicare are convoluted and confusing. This whole thing was essentially a compromise within Congress. They wanted to get the drug companies on board to be able to offer their prescriptions. There was a lot of lobbying going on. I would argue what they made was sausage. You've got 4 phases. The first phase is a deductible. Well, that deductible can be as high as $545. But that deductible may or may not apply to your prescriptions. I personally have 2 prescriptions. They're both generics. I have a Part D plan that has that $545 deductible. I don't pay anything for my prescriptions. They're generics. They're tier 1s. They don't trigger that deductible. So you have to have a prescription that's a tier 3, 4, 5, or even 6 nowadays in order to trigger that deductible. Otherwise, it's there. It could conceivably be charged if you were prescribed something later in the year. But if all you're taking is generics, you're probably not going to be paying that $545. You're initially in what they call the initial coverage period. And that's when you have a set copayment for your prescriptions. Now, that's the way it is at work right now. Your copays don't change from January to December. Under Medicare, they could. And this is where it gets confusing. So if you had brand name prescriptions where the full cost of those prescriptions was about $5,000 during the course of the year, now all of a sudden you've entered the coverage gap. That doesn't mean that there's $5,000 out of your pocket. That means between what you've paid for prescriptions, what the drug company has paid or contributed towards your prescriptions, and what the drug plan has paid towards your prescriptions exceeds that figure of $5,030. Now you're in the coverage gap. And then instead of paying a set copayment, now you'll start being charged a percent, in this case, this year, and forever after. It's changed over the years, but it's going to be 25% of the actual retail cost. So 25% of an expensive drug can be expensive. And in fact, once you have incurred a lot of expense under that phase, then you enter the catastrophic phase of the drug plan. And at this point, they cap the benefit. In years past, this is the first year where they've capped the benefit. In years past, they would charge you a percentage, a lower percentage than the 25%, once you entered that catastrophic phase. But this year, they cap you. The figure that they have published is at $8,000 out of your pocket. I've not seen that in reality. The most that I've seen anybody pay for covered drugs this year is $3,333. Now, I can't find that in any literature, but I've done probably thousands of drug analysis, and I've yet to see one that exceeded $3,333 for covered drugs. And that's the disclaimer. Not all prescriptions are covered. And they'll put that right in the tier. They put NC. That stands for not covered. And that means essentially Medicare doesn't cover it, either because it's too new to the market and they don't believe that it's been around long enough that they feel safe about it, or there's an alternative on the market that's a lot cheaper, and they're essentially saying, we're not going to pay for this more expensive drug. And they do have automatic generic substitution for drugs under Medicare. You need to keep that in mind. Now, the next slide is sort of a summary of that, what I just said. So there's 4 phases, and I have 3 of those phases here in red: deductible, coverage gap, catastrophic care. And the reason they're in red is that they may not impact you. They may not impact you at all. If you have tier 1 and tier 2 drugs, they're not going to impact you. That's my situation. So I'm in the initial coverage period the whole year, and my prescriptions are zero. So I don't pay anything for them. Now, that's fortunate, because what I find over the years is, especially as people approach 85 years old and older, that's when I start to see prescriptions accrue big time. So a list of 10 or more drugs is relatively common as we get older. The record so far, I did one that somebody had 32 drugs. And that's the all-time record. And that wasn't even an old person. That was somebody who had some real serious medical issues. But it becomes an issue as we get older. Now, in Massachusetts and in most states, there's a whole bunch of different options for Part D plans. This year, it's 25 to 27 different drug plans. Sometimes people say, geez, if I spend more in a drug plan, I know I get better coverage. That's not the way it works. The way it works is they all make a formulary, a list of covered drugs, that it's designed either to generate membership. In other words, they've got good value associated with their list of covered drugs, or it's designed to generate profit. And it doesn't seem to be much of anything in between. So I tell people, don't pay more than you have to in any given year. Remember, you can change the drug plan, you can change the Part C plan, you can change the supplement plan in the fall of every year between October 15th and December 7th. So you don't want to fine-tune it too much. You know that it may change during the course of the year, but you can change your drug plan, because that's the piece that I find from year to year that saves people the most money. It used to be that people would take a drug plan and then they would forget about it. And they would have maybe the premium taken out of their Social Security payment, so they even forget how much they're paying for a premium. I advise people every year, look at the drug plan. That's certainly what we do for our clients, is we look to see, does this continue to be the most cost-effective option for this person, or is there a better selection for this year? The thing that I want to focus on this slide is COBRA. So when I find people that get penalized for not doing something when they were supposed to do it, inevitably COBRA is involved somewhere. So when you go on COBRA, that means that you've lost your employer group coverage. You're not working for the company anymore. by definition, when you're on COBRA, you're not working for the company anymore. And when you're over 65, the government wants you on one of two things. They want to see you on an employer group plan, and they refer to that as alternative creditable coverage, or they want to see you on a Medicare plan. And COBRA is neither of those things. So if you go on COBRA and you're either over 65 to begin it, or you're over 65 at some point when you're on it, you need to take both Part A and Part B of Medicare. Remember, Part B is going to cost you a premium. But you have to take that because if you have any sort of a medical issue and you're on COBRA, the COBRA carrier, the third-party administrator, the health plan that you're on, expect that the bill goes to Medicare, not to them. Medicare is primary. The bill goes to them. Medicare pays their piece. They send the balance to the COBRA carrier. COBRA carrier, I've seen deny the claim if Medicare didn't pick up as primary. So they can do that. And the only time that they really do that is all of a sudden they're presented with a large claim. And they've got a large claim because Medicare didn't pay their piece, and Medicare didn't pay their piece because that beneficiary didn't have Medicare. They didn't have A and they didn't have B. So Medicare didn't pay it, and then the health plan says, wait a minute, this is not the way the contract reads. This person is supposed to have Medicare. We're not going to pay until Medicare pays. So it becomes a finger-pointing game. And that's just something you want to avoid. And I don't need you to remember that. I just need you to remember COBRA's a problem. If I'm going to go on COBRA, let me think this through a little bit. Let me do some research. Let me call Peter. Do something. Don't just go on it without Medicare.